Session 829. Last Monday evening, Seth gave a very short private session for Jane. It turned out to consist of just one page of double-spaced, typewritten information. During the session, Seth said that he was preparing some special material for Rupert, but except for the excellent relaxation effects Jane has experienced since then, we have yet to learn what else may be involved. In Jane's case, I mean something different by relaxation than might be expected. Just recently, I quoted her in Volume 2 of Unknown Reality. In part, and this is Jane's words, it's a sort of super relaxation, almost profound and mental and physical at once, a completely different thing than just yawning, even though I might be yawning. It involves a curious sense of dropping down inwardly, of going slowly beneath the realities we usually perceive. Such a relaxation, then, is almost an extension of biological insight. Even while immersed in her most enjoyable state, Jane still wanted to hold the session. "I think I know his subject matter for tonight," she said, "but I don't know if it'll be dictation or not." Then she took off her glasses and she went into trance. Good evening. Good evening, Seth. Now, the animals do have imagination, regardless of your current thought. Yet man is so gifted that he directs his experience and forms his civilizations largely through the use of his imaginative abilities. You do not understand this point clearly at all, but your social organizations, your governments, these are based upon imaginative principles. The basis of your most intimate experience, the framework behind all of your organized structures, rest upon a reality that is not considered valid by the very institutions that are formed through its auspices. It is now nearing Easter and the yearly commemoration of what is considered historical fact, the resurrection and ascension of Christ into heaven. Untold millions have in one way or another commemorated that occasion through the centuries. Private lives have merged with public sentiment and religious fervor. There have been numberless village festivals or intimate family gatherings, and church services performed on Easter Sunday now forgotten. There have been bloody wars fought on the same account, and private persecutions in which those who did not agree with one or another's religious dogmas were quite simply killed for the good of their souls. There have been spiritual rebirths and regenerations, and ungodly slaughter as well, as a result of the meaning of Easter. Blood and flesh have certainly been touched then, and lives changed in that regard. All of these religious and political structures that you certainly recognize as valid, arising from the event of Christ's ascension, existed and do exist because of an ideal. The ideal was the result of a spectacular act in the imagination that then leapt upon the historical landscape, highlighting all of the events of the time so that they became illuminated indeed with a blessed and unearthly light. The ideal of man's survival of death was not new. The ideal of God's descent to earth was ancient. The old religious myths fit a different kind of people, however, and lasted for as many centuries in the past as Christianity has reached into the future. The miraculous merging of imagination with historical time, however, became less and less synchronized, so that only rites, rites, spelled, remained, and the old gods seized the imagination no longer. The time was ripe for Christianity. Because man has not understood the characteristics of the world of imagination, he has thus far always insisted upon turning his myths into historical fact, for he considers the factual world alone as the real one. A man, literally of flesh and blood, must then prove beyond all doubt that each and every other human being survives death. by dying, of course, and then by rising physically perceived into heaven. Each man does survive death, and each woman, but only such a literal-minded species would insist upon the physical death of a God-man as proof of the pudding. Again, Christ was not crucified. The historical Christ, as he is thought of, was a man illuminated by psychic realities, touched with the infinite realization that any one given individual was, by virtue of his or her existence, a contact between all that is and mankind. Christ saw that in each person divinity and humanity met, and that man survived death by virtue of his existence within the divine. Without exception, all of the horrors connected with Christianity's name came from following the letter rather than the spirit of the law, or by insistence upon literal interpretations, while the spiritual imaginative concepts beneath were ignored. Again, man directs his existence through the use of his imagination, a feat that does distinguish him from the animals. What connects people and separates them is the power of ideal and the force of imagination. Patriotism, family loyalty, political affiliations, the ideas behind these have the greatest practical applications in your world. You project yourself into time like children through freely imagining your growth. You instantly color physical experience and nature itself with the tints of your unique imaginative processes. Unless you think quite consistently and deeply, the importance of the imagination quite escapes you, and yet it literally forms the world that you experience and the mass world in which you live. The theory of evolution, for instance, is an imaginative construct, and yet through its light some generations have now viewed their world. It is not only that you think of yourself differently, but you actually experience a different kind of self. Your institutions change their aspects accordingly, so that experience fits the beliefs that you have about it. You act in certain ways. You view the entire universe in a fashion that did not exist before, so that imagination and belief intangibly structure your subjective experience and your objective circumstances. In all of the other imaginative constructs, for example, whatever their merits and disadvantages, man felt himself to be a part of a plan. The planner might be God, or nature itself, or man within nature, or nature within man. There might be many gods or one, but there was a meaning in the universe. Even the idea of fate gave man something to act against and roused him to action. The ideal of a meaningless universe, however, is in itself a highly creative, imaginative act. Animals, for example, could not imagine such an idiocy, so that the theory shows the incredible accomplishment of an obviously ordered mind and intellect that can imagine itself to be the result of non-order or chaos. You have a creature who is capable of mapping its own brain, imagining that the brain's fantastic regulated order could emerge from a reality that itself has no meaning. Indeed, then, the theory actually says that the ordered universe magically emerged. And evolutionists must certainly believe in a god of chance somewhere, or in coincidence with a capital C, for their theories would make no sense at all otherwise. The world of the imagination is indeed your contact with your own source. Its characteristics are the closest to those in Framework 2 that you can presently encounter. Your experience of history, of the days of your life, is invisibly formed by those ideals that exist in the imagination only, and then are projected upon the physical world. This applies to your individual beliefs about yourself and the way you see yourself in your imagination. You are having wars between the Jews and the Arabs and the Christians once again. because emphasis is put upon literal interpretation of spiritual truths. In each person, the imaginative world, its force and power, merges into historical reality. In each person, the ultimate and unassailable and unquenchable power of all that is individualized and dwells in time. Man's imagination can carry him into those other realms, but when he tries to squeeze those truths into frameworks too small, he distorts and bends inner realities so that they become jagged dogmas. The latest growth of fundamentalist religion has arisen as a countermeasure against the theories of evolution. You have then an overcompensation, for in the Darwinian world there was no meaning and no laws. There were no standards of right or wrong, so that large portions of the people felt rootless. The fundamentalists returned to an authoritarian religion in which the slightest act must be regulated. They gave release, and they are giving release, to the emotions and are thus rebelling against scientific intellectualism. They will see the world in black and white terms again, with good and evil clearly delineated in the most simplistic terms, and thus escape a slippery, thematic universe in which man's feelings seemed to give him no foothold at all. Unfortunately, the fundamentalists accept literal interpretations of intuitive realities in such a way that they further narrow the channels through which their psychic abilities can flow. The fundamentalist framework in this period of time, for all of its fervor, is not rich. For example, Christianity was in the past, with its numerous saints, is instead a fanatical Puritan vein, peculiarly American in character, and restrictive rather than expansive. For the bursts of emotion are highly structured. That is, the emotions are limited in most areas of life, permitted only an explosive religious expression under certain conditions, when they are not so much spontaneously expressed as suddenly released from the dam of usual repression. The imagination always seeks expression. It is always creative, and underneath the frameworks of society, it provides fresh incentives and new avenues for fulfillment that can become harnessed through fanatical belief. When this happens, your institutions become more repressive, and violence often emerges as a result. If you look for signs of God's vengeance, you will find them everywhere. An avalanche or a flood or an earthquake will not be seen as a natural act of the earth's natural creativity, but instead as a punishment from God for sin. In evolution, man's nature is immoral, and anything goes for survival's sake. There is no possibility of any spiritual survival as far as most evolutionists are concerned. The fundamentalists would rather believe in man's inherent sinful nature, for at least their belief system provides for a framework in which he can be saved. Christ's message was that each man is good inherently and is an individualized portion of the divine, and yet a civilization based upon that precept has never been attempted. The vast social structures of Christianity were instead based upon man's sinful nature, not the organizations and structures that might allow him to become good or to obtain the goodness that Christ quite clearly perceived man already possessed. It seems almost a sacrilege to say that man is good when everywhere you meet contradictions, for too often man certainly appears to act as if his motives were instead those of a born killer. You have been taught not to trust the very fabric of your being. You cannot expect yourselves to act rationally or altruistically in any consistent manner if you believe that you are automatically degraded or that your nature is so flawed that such performance is uncharacteristic. Give us a moment. You are a part of nature that has learned to make choices, a part of nature that naturally and automatically produces dreams and beliefs about which you then organize your reality. There are many effects which you do not like, but you possess a unique kind of consciousness in which each individual has a hand in the overall formation of a world reality. Let me make that just a bit. And you are participating at a level of existence in which you are learning how to transform the imaginative realm of probabilities into a more or less specific, physically experienced world. In a way, you choose from an infinite, endless, uncomputable number of ideas and sculpt these into the physical fragments that compose normal experience. You do this in such a way that the timeless events are experienced in time, and so that they mix and merge to conform to the dimensions of your reality. Along the way, there are accomplishments that are as precious as any creatures of any kind could produce. There are also great failures, but these are failures only in comparison with the glittering inner knowledge of the imagination that holds for you those ideas against which you judge your acts. Those ideas are present in each individual. They are natural inclinations toward growth and fulfillment. That was dictation. That was also the end of the chapter, and I bid you a fond good evening. Thank you very much, Seth. Good night. I'd say that much of Seth's excellent delivery since break is related to some of his material in the 825th session, including this passage. I put the word good in quotes for now because in your misconceptions about the nature of good and evil, which we will discuss somewhat later, I added resurrection and to Seth's passage because Jane told me that according to ordinary teaching, Christ's resurrection from the dead took place on Easter Sunday, the third day following his crucifixion on Friday, while his ascension into heaven transpired at an indefinite later time, up to 40 days later, as stated in the writings of St. Luke in the Acts of the Apostles. As far as we know, Seth's inference that Christ's resurrection and ascension took place on the same day is contrary to popular belief. Here Seth seemed to telescope the two events into one. Jane wrote, or refer to them together as if the distinction didn't exist for him. Seth may be implying that the ascension was the main issue of the Christ story, rather than the resurrection, or telling us that the two events are so intertwined that magically as to be treated as one. Since we do not arbitrarily change Seth's conversation or something, his reference here to the ascension rather than the resurrection is similar to one that soon follows, stand as they were given. But obviously we did decide to add this note. At the time, Jane and I checked a number of biblical references of the New Testament and discovered that Seth's passage seems to be a case where he showed a knowledge we don't consciously possess. For we learn that of the four Gospels, according to Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, in that order, some scholars believe that Luke and John can be read as stating that Christ's resurrection and ascension took place on the same day. Yet in Acts, Luke postulates the 40-day interval between the two events. Originally, Luke composed his Gospel and Acts as one treatise. The two were separated early in the 2nd century. Out of such contradictions as those implied in Luke's case, however, confusion and opposing opinions reign when one studies the Gospels and related material. Christ himself left no written records, nor are there any eyewitnesses or contemporary accounts of his life. In the 591st session for Seth Speaks, I noted claims for an earlier date for the origin of the first gospel, that according to Mark, nevertheless, most authorities still believe that the Gospels were written about AD 65 and 110. Since Christ was presumably crucified around AD 30, this means that some 35 to 40 years passed before the advent of Mark's account. There are many consistencies in the Gospel, but also inconsistencies that cannot be resolved. Even the authorship of the Gospels, according to Matthew and John, are now being questioned. A study of the New Testament books alone can quickly lead one into a maze of questions. Why isn't the resurrection itself described? Why are there so few references to the ascension? Matthew doesn't mention it at all in his Gospel, for example, and Paul alludes to it only once in his writings. Is the Gospel according to Luke merely schematic rather than chronological? If time did elapse between Christ's resurrection and ascension, where was he physically during all of that period, other than on the few occasions cited in the Gospels and in Acts, when on various occasions he revealed himself to the women who discovered his empty tomb, to the apostles, and to some others? Sometimes Christ appears as an apparition, but as Seth commented in a private session, you could not have a world in which the newly risen dead mixed with the living. An existence in a spiritual realm had to follow such a resurrection. I'd say that the 829th session, Seth spoke out of a knowledge of biblical tradition and history. That is, he wasn't saying that Christ did rise from the dead or ascend into heaven, but referring to Christianity's interpretation of its own creative Christ story. Seth has always maintained that Christ wasn't crucified to begin with. Indeed, he told us in the same private session that in the facts of history there was no crucifixion, resurrection, or ascension. In the terms of history, there was no biblical Christ. In the terms of the biblical drama, however, Christ was crucified. It was the Jewish tradition that nourished the new religion in its early stages. Christ, as you know, was a common name. So when I say that there was a man named Christ involved in those events, I do not mean to say that he was the biblical Christ. His life was one of those that were finally used to compose the composite image of the biblical Christ. And finally, here's an answer to a number of inquiries from readers. And in it I quoted a remark Seth made to me the following September. You can have more material on Jerusalem or Christ now or when you want it. You can have the Christ book when you want it. So far we've done nothing but about producing the Christ book, except to talk about it once in a while. Well, it's true that I have ambitious feelings about doing a book on religion, Jane said as we discussed this note, but for all that, if Seth started dictating it tomorrow, I'd do it. Many issues would be involved, maybe even current national events. I think Seth would know the best time for such a book to be done and publicly introduced. When he said, you can have the Christ book when you want it, I think he was just stating his willingness to comply. Maybe he knows that really wanting it might take a while, at least on my part, but I do know my attitude about getting such a book has improved a lot in the last year or two. Neither of us has any doubt that the Christ book would be controversial indeed. According to Seth, then, those old religious myths lasted for about 20 centuries, dating from 2000 BC. Once again, see my material on evolution. Anyway, I'm not going to read that part. Let me get down to the next chapter. The Mechanics of Experience, Session 830. Once Jane began dictating mass events 11 months ago, I have mentioned our checking the printer's page proofs for 2 of her other books. Volume 1 of Unknown Reality and Cezanne. Now I can add a 3rd book, James, to the list. I'm not going to read about all his books and things he talks about. I'm going to go right to Seth. Good evening. Good evening, Seth. To begin with, dictation, new chapter, the mechanics of experience. Your world and everything in it exists first in the imagination, then. You have been taught to focus all of your attention upon physical events so that they carry the authenticity of reality for you. Thoughts, feelings, or beliefs appear to be secondary, subjective, or somehow not real, and they seem to rise in response to an already established field of physical data. You usually think, for example, that your feelings about a given event are primarily reactions to the event itself. It seldom occurs to you that the feelings themselves might be primary, and that the particular event was somehow a response to your emotions, rather than the other way around. The all-important matter of your focus is largely responsible for your interpretation of any event. For an exercise, then, imagine for a while that the subjective world of your thoughts, feelings, inner images, and fantasies represent the rock-bed reality from which individual physical events emerge. Look at the world for a change, from the inside out, so to speak. Imagine that physical experience is somehow the materialization of your subjective reality. Forget what you have learned about reactions and stimuli. Ignore for a time everything you have believed and see your thoughts as the real events. Try to view normal physical occurrences as the concrete physical reactions in space and time to your own feelings and beliefs. For indeed, your subjective world causes your physical experience. In titling this chapter, I use the word mechanics because mechanisms suggest smooth technological workings. While the world is not a machine, its inner workings are such that no technology could ever copy them. This involves a natural mechanics in which the inner dimensions of consciousness everywhere emerge to form a materialized, cohesive physical existence. Again, your interpretations of identity teach you to focus awareness in such a way that you cannot follow the strands of consciousness that connect you with all portions of nature. In a way, the world is like a multidimensional, exotic plant growing in space and time. Each thought, dream, imaginative encounter, hope, or fear, growing naturally into your own bloom. A plant of incredible variety, never for a moment the same, in which each smallest root, leaf, stem, or flower has a part to play and is connected with the whole. Even those of you who intellectually agree that you form your own reality find it difficult to accept emotionally in certain areas. You are, of course, literally hypnotized into believing that your feelings arise in response to events. Your feelings, however, cause the events you perceive. Secondarily, you do, of course, then react to those events. You have been taught that your feelings must necessarily be tied to specific physical happenings. You may be sad because a relative has died, for example, or because you have lost a job, or because you have been rebuffed by a lover, or for any number of other accepted reasons. You are told that your feelings must be in response to events that are happening or have happened. Often, of course, your feelings happen ahead of time because those feelings are the initial realities from which events flow. A relative might be ready to die, though no exterior sign has been given. The relative's feelings might well be mixed, containing portions of relief and sadness, which you might then perceive, but the primary events are subjective. It is somewhat of a psychological trick in your day and age to come to the realization that you do in fact form your experience and your world simply because the weight of evidence seems to be so loaded at the other end because of your habits of perception. The realization is like one that comes at one time or another to many people in the dream state, when suddenly they awaken while still in the dream, realizing first of all that they are dreaming, and secondarily that they are themselves creating the experienced drama. To understand that you create your own reality requires that same kind of awakening from the normal awake state, at least for many people. Of course, have this knack more than others. The realization itself does indeed change the rules of the game as far as you are concerned, to a rather considerable degree. There are reasons why I am mentioning this now rather than in earlier books. Indeed, our books follow their own rhythms, and this one is the way of a further exploration upon the nature of personal reality. As long as you believe that either good events or bad ones are meted out by a personified God as a reward or punishment for your actions, or on the other hand, that events are largely meaningless, chaotic, subjective knots in the tangled web of an accidental Darwinian world, then you cannot consciously understand your own creativity or play the role in the universe that you are capable of playing as individuals or as a species. You will instead live in a world where events happen to you, in which you must do sacrifice to the gods of one kind or another, or see yourselves as victims of an uncaring nature. While still preserving the integrity of physical events as you understand them, you must alter the focus of your attention to some extent, so that you begin to perceive the connections between your subjective reality at any given time and those events that you perceive at any given time. You are the initiator of those events. This recognition does indeed involve a new performance on the part of your own consciousness, a mental and imaginative leap that gives you control and direction over achievements that you have always performed, though without your conscious awareness. As mentioned before, early man had such an identification of subjective and objective realities. As a species, however, you have developed what can almost be called a secondary nature, a world of technology in which you also now have your existence, and complicated social structures have emerged from it. To develop that kind of structure necessitated a division between subjective and objective worlds. Now, however, it is highly important that you realize your position and accomplish the manipulation of consciousness that will allow you to take true conscious responsibility for your actions and your experience. You can come awake from your normal waking state, and that is the natural next step for consciousness to follow, one for which your biology has already equipped you. Indeed, each person does attain that recognition now and then. It brings triumphs and challenges as well. In those areas of life where you are satisfied, give yourselves credit, and in those areas where you are not, remind yourselves that you are involved in a learning process. You are daring enough to accept the responsibilities for your actions. Let us look more clearly, however, at the ways in which your private world causes your daily experience, and how it emerges from the experiences of others. Take your break. I'm going to skip down to where he's talking again, which is the next session, session 831. The roses seemed to linger particularly late last fall. Jane wrote this little poem when I brought in a few blooms from the climber growing up the trellis at the northeast corner of our hill house near the kitchen window. The temporal rose contains eternal seeds in which the entire universe, and you and I, are all implied. Jane's poem can also serve as a symbol to show that she hasn't held a session for mass events for 42 weeks, or since giving the 830th session last March. Indeed, the summer, fall, and winter of 1978 have passed, and we're into the next year, and a very cold and stormy one it is so far. We accomplished many things during those 9.5 months, however, including the holding of 56 non-book sessions. Those sessions, whether in private or not, are of course more than double in number the 22 sessions Jane has given for mass events. In connection with our feelings about the long intervals that have materialized several times during the production of this book, see my opening notes for the 815th session, especially those concerning simultaneous time, and my statement that we do not plan to ask Seth when the book will be done. I'll continue our chronology here, then, by describing many of our professional activities since last March, and follow it with Jane's own account of at least some of the reasons for the long interruption in book work. Although each of us has looked over mass events occasionally, still it seems strange to hear Seth come through with the new material for it after all this time has passed, and equally strange to resume work on these notes. I rechecked my opening notes for the last session. Yes, we did finish correcting the page proofs for James, for her book James, early in April. And then I'm going to skip on down because he's going to talk about books, and I want to get on with Seth. And he talks about, but if you want to, anybody wants to read all of this that I skip over sometime, well, this is a file, esotericonline.net. Anyway, you just can find this so easily. Just Google it. PDF books of Seth. There's quite a lot there. Okay, dictation. Good evening. This is a continuation of the chapter, The Mechanics of Experience. Organized religion has committed many important blunders, yet for centuries Christianity provided a context accepted by large portions of the known world in which experience could be judged against very definite rules. Experience once focused, chiseled, and yet allowed some rich expression as long as it stayed within the boundaries set by religious dogma. If a man was a sinner, still there was a way of redemption, and the immortality of the soul went largely unquestioned, of course. There were set rules for almost all kinds of social encounters and religious experiences. There were set ceremonies accepted by nearly all for death and birth and the important stages in between. Church was the authority, and the individual lived out his or her life almost automatically, structuring personal experience so that it fit within the accepted norm. Within those boundaries, certain kinds of experience flourished, and of course others did not. In your society, there is no such overall authority. The individual must make his or her own way through a barrage of different value systems, making decisions that were largely unthought of when a son followed his father's trade automatically, for example, or when marriages were made largely for economic reasons. So, your present experience is quite different than that of those forefathers who lived in the medieval world, say, and you cannot appreciate the differences in your present subjective attitudes and in the quality as well as the kind of social intercourse that exists now. For all its many eras, at its best, Christianity proclaimed the ultimate meaning for each person's life. There was no question but that life had meaning, whether or not you might agree as to the particular meaning assigned to it. Men's dreams were also different in those times, filled far more with metaphysical images, for example, more alive with saints and demons. But overall, one framework of belief existed, and all experience was judged in its light. Now you have far more decisions to make, and in a world of conflicting beliefs brought into your living room through newspaper and television, you must try to find the meaning of your life or the meaning of life. You can think in terms of experiments. You may try this or that. You may run from one religion to another, or from religion to science, or vice versa. This is true in a way that was impossible the masses of the people of medieval times. The improved methods of communication alone mean that you are everywhere surrounded by varying theories, cultures, cults, and schools. In some important areas, this means that the mechanics of experience are actually becoming more apparent, for they are no longer hidden beneath one belief system. Give us a moment. Your subjective options are far greater, and yet so, of course, is the necessity to place that subjective experience into meaningful terms. If you believe that you do indeed form your own reality, then you instantly come up against a whole new group of questions. If you actually construct your own experience individually and in mass, why does so much of it seem negative? You create your own reality, or it is created for you. It is an accidental universe, or it is not. Now, in medieval times, organized religion or organized Christianity presented each individual with a screen of beliefs through which the personal self was perceived. Portions of the self that were not perceivable through that screen were almost invisible to the private person. Problems were sent by God as punishment or warning. The mechanics of experience were hidden behind that screen. Now, the beliefs of Charles Darwin and Sigmund Freud alike have formed together to give you a different screen. Experience is accepted and perceived only as it is received through that screen. If Christendom saw man as blighted by original sin, Darwinism and Freudian views see him as part of a flawed species in which individual life rests precariously, ever at the beck and call of the species' needs and with survival as the prime goal. A survival, however, without meaning. The psyche's grandeur is ignored, the individual's sense of belonging with nature eroded, for it is at nature's expense, it seems, that he must survive. One's greatest dreams and worst fears alike become the result of glandular imbalance or of neuroses from childhood traumas. Yet, in the midst of these beliefs, each individual seeks to find a context in which his or her life has meaning, a purpose which will rouse the self to action, a drama in whose theme private actions will have significance. There are intellectual values and emotional ones, and sometimes there are needs of an emotional nature that must be met, regardless of intellectual judgments. The Church provided a cosmic drama in which even the life of the sinner had value, even if only to show God's compassion. In your society, however, this sterile psychic environment often leads to rebellion. People take steps to bring meaning and drama into their lives, even if intellectually they refuse to make the connection. And take your break. And when I do the next video, I will commence from this page. This is the Duck Lady. Over and out for now.